Hey, welcome back. So we're starting the second portion of our Wise Tour, and I must admit that we're prepping that for quite some time, and we get the people and the topics lined up and so on, and we get to arrive there, and we're excited and finally, but with this first portion, like I'm pumped. I'm really really full of energy. So the content is so great. So that's fantastic. So thanks for being with us. We are about 300 persons when we count both YouTube and Twitch. They're live. Thank you very much for being there. Thank you for your comment. Thank you for your questions. It's really nice to read the chat, and there's really something friendly and kind of I don't know, chit chat around the fireside kind of thing sometimes. So that's really appreciated. Thank you very much. Okay, so for this second portion, so first we're gonna start with Suckerpunch talking about Ghost of Tsushima. So we'll have Brad Mayer, Michel Hébert, and Andrew Burish talking about the game, and followed by the panel discussion that will be moderated by Damien later. So yeah, if we were in person, I would say, well, welcome to the stage, Brad, Andrew, and Michelle. Here you are, all smiling and so on. So great. Welcome to the Wise Tour. I'm sure we're gonna see a fantastic presentation from you as well, and I'll just leave you with the content and everything, and I'll get back in about an hour with some questions from the audience. All right. See you later.
Cool. Thanks, Simon. So yes, I am Brad. I'm the audio director at Suckerpunch. Michelle is one of our sound designers, and Andrew is a senior music editor at Sony Interactive. But he's actually been working on Suckerpunch projects since Infamous 2. Before we start, I actually just want to say it's kind of cool and coincident that almost exactly 12 years ago today, I was part of, I think it was the first Wise Roadshow, talking about Spider-Man Web of Shadows. And that was also where I met a young Damien Kaspauer for the first time. So it's pretty cool to kind of have this all circle back and get to talk about Ghost of Tsushima this time. And so what we want to talk about is the way that we tell stories with sound in Ghost, just highlighting a few examples. Before we do that, though, I actually just wanted to quickly acknowledge the team that made this possible. You know, this is, as Simon said at the beginning, it's such a huge game, and it could not have happened without all of these people across various disciplines. So just really wanted to kind of call all these people out because they really made it possible. The next order of business before we dig in is, if you have not played the game, maybe you want to just stop right now, come back in an hour for the panel, and then watch this on demand, because there will be some spoilers. I apologize. We'll try to give you some heads up, but I cannot guarantee it. So if you haven't played the game and you really want to be left in the dark, you might want to close your ears for the next hour. So we're calling this talk Sonic Storytelling. And what do we mean by that, right? Storytelling, generally, we think of characters, of plot, and of action. But, you know, what about tone? What about pacing? What about feeling? These are all things that are just as important in telling a story, and all are areas where sound specifically is critical. So we're going to focus on three things here in this talk, and there's a lot more that we could touch on, but we only have an hour. So we're going to talk a lot about ambience in the world. We're going to talk a lot about music. And then we're going to show a few key examples from the game that kind of highlight all the different elements that we use to help tell our stories with sound. So the first thing that I want to talk about with regards to ambience is wind. And, you know, wind is such an integral part of both story and gameplay in Ghost. And there's kind of two systems of wind that I want to just touch on briefly, because each is unique and each plays a separate role in helping to tell the story in Ghost. So the first thing is what we called our wind rig, and it's essentially our kind of base layer that all of our ambience sits atop. And what this is we have 4 emitters that are positioned around the listener, each about, I think, 5 or 6 meters away from the listener and about 1.5 meters above the listener. And each one of these is independently aware of the environment that it's in. And so just to give you a sense, these are the actual environments that we have in the game. And you can kind of see they're divided into major and minor areas. So forest, for example, is a major area, and bamboo is a minor area. And then each of those four emitters, this is kind of what it looks like in Wwise. So you can see we first have this player blanket loop. And essentially what that is all of those blend containers up top. And so we're actually blending between different layers based on wind intensity, wind gusting, rain intensity, so we can really control how the wind is behaving, especially amping it up when there's storms and things like that. In addition, we do have a separate storm layer to, again, just crank it up so that when the player is in a storm, they really feel it. We have a separate loop for when you're inside of houses, so that way we kind of make a really unique sound of wind kind of whipping around the buildings that they might be in, as well as kind of shoji doors and other things kind of moving around. We also have a rain drip layer in here that is used only in forests. And you might be thinking, okay, this is wind. Why are you having rain in your wind rig? The answer to that was we really wanted to have it so that we had ambient dripping in the forest after it rained. And the easiest, simplest way to do that was to kind of insert it into the system, because the system already existed. We could very easily be looking at those major and minor environments that we're in and know, hey, I'm in a forest, it just rained, so I'm just going to play the drip under those parameters. And, that really helped tell you, okay, great. It was just raining here. So, little subtle elements like that are kind of what we're talking about in the way that audio is helping to tell the story. And the last thing here is a wind layer that is kind of a sweetener layer specifically for duels. And again, with our duels, we have this standoff at the beginning of each one. And it's this really tense, very sparse moment where we kind of go in close to each character and show them getting ready to begin their duel. And so we have this kind of very sparse wind that we play only in those moments to also just help elevate that and really push that kind of tension between those two characters. So I'm going to show a movie in just a minute that just kind of shows what the wind rig looks like. And what we'll do is we'll kind of spin around and you'll see these blue circles, which are the 4 emitters. And we'll fly into a couple forests and you'll hear the sound of just the wind rig. And then you'll see some annotation on screen. And that is kind of when we're actually bringing in all the other sounds. So you can kind of see how the rest of the ambient sits on top of the wind rig. The one thing that I just want to note before we start the movie is kind of what the direction of the wind rig was, right? So Ghost obviously is a huge game. There's a lot going on, and wind is a very kind of noise-based sample generally, similar to waterfalls. And we had this exact same problem with waterfalls, where when we initially had our waterfalls in the game, it just made the whole soundscape really noisy. So what we did with waterfalls is we focused more on the sound of water flow and kind of the way that the rocks break up water movement. And so you're getting a little bit more of kind of the mid and high frequency rather than just a broadband noise thing. So we did a similar approach with the wind rig, and Safar Bake, one of our sound designers, was tasked with, instead of making the sound of wind, to make the sound of the environment as it's affected by wind. So as you go into a forest, you're not just hearing blowing, but rather you're hearing the trees creaking. And in a bamboo forest, you're going to hear the clacking of the bamboo against each other. In the grassland, you're hearing kind of the pampas grass moving and swaying rather than just blowing and gusting. So let's just take a quick look at that. Okay, so the next area, the next part of wind really that we wanted to talk about was the guiding wind. And for those who haven't played the game, instead of having traditional mini map or compass, we actually use wind as a navigational aid for the game. And so using wind as part of the UI is super novel, but we also tied it into the story where wind is seen as the spirit of Jin's deceased father, Kazumasa. So let's watch a quick video of kind of the introduction of the wind rig, and then we'll go back and talk about what we did to kind of make it unique and stand out from the rest of the wind in the game.
Father, how do I save?
So Josh Lord, our senior sound designer, did the sound design for that. And what he did to kind of separate it from the rest of the wind is he added this tonal aspect to it. And that not only kind of gave it a unique sound and character, but it also kind of imbued it with this kind of sound of Jin's father's spirit. And the way that we did that is we kind of blew into flutes to get that kind of interesting tonal sound, and then he mixed that with like whispers and other kind of more human aspects so that it sounded much more unique than the rest of the wind. And that vocal-like quality kind of really gave it this sense of presence and uniqueness and this kind of tying back to Jin's father without sounding supernatural. Now, as far as what that looked like in Wwise, the wind hint base that you see across all of our environments there was that tonal layer. And then we also mixed in just a little bit of kind of detail from each of the environments. And the reason for that is because the windicator, the way it behaved, or sorry, the guiding wind, we called it the windicator internally because it was the indicator made of wind. It just rolled right off the tongue. But the guiding wind, this was actually the design document that I gave to the programmer when we were designing it. And the way that it behaves in game is we have 3 splines, one going kind of through the listener and one on either side offset. And based on the current wind vector, which is actually kind of following towards where your next objective is, we can play a sound that runs along that spline. And so the gusts had fixed timings, which allowed us to design assets that kind of peaked as the emitter got near the listener. And then it would just kind of pick one of those 3 to play on. And so we'll show a video of kind of how that plays in game. And you'll notice that there's kind of 2 different aspects of the guiding wind. You can call the wind, which gives you this really big moment of a gust, and you can see everything move and you can hear it really well. And then we also have these really subtle ones that are kind of just constantly playing and moving along those splines consistently. And so you just kind of always hear this little tonal element of wind travel along those splines as you're playing, and those are just kind of really subtle clues as to where you should be going. And then if you ever get stuck, you can just call the wind and you get one of these big ones. So take a look. So super subtle, but you can see how it kind of sits on top of the other wind and has this completely unique identity. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Michelle, who's going to talk about something that you might not think of normally when you're thinking of ambience and storytelling, which is the construction of our buildings.
Thanks, Brad. So we wanted to give a voice to buildings and man-made structures. Constructions of 13th century feudal Japan offered a variety of characteristics, material types, and storytelling elements. We made use of creaks, wind, and rattle sounds to give these buildings life and to give the player an immersive experience. The craftsmanship of these 13th century buildings were impressive, but nothing was made to be durable. These were constructed with mostly raw materials such as wood, bamboo, and grass. The state of disrepair or damage from the Mongol invasion also helped influence the sound design choices we made. Broken, dilapidated, and scorched buildings are fragile. We used a palette of wood and bamboo creaks of different sizes and textures and intensity to provide audio storytelling elements. We added layers of footstep sweeteners, so as the player walks across a collapsed roof, for example, the feeling is rickety and it's a different experience than walking across an intact building that's been untouched by the invasion. In the next slide, you'll see on the window there's these spaces through the wooden slats of the windows, and the wind passes through these slats. That added another layer of character to the structures. So a small touch of detail that helps reinforce the listener's immersion. We chose to hand place emitters on these windows and also the volumes within the buildings and structures, as well as on doors that were proxied into the buildings. And this allowed for a finesse with our placement of the sonic elements, but we could still propagate them throughout the world, reduce the amount of hand touching that we had to do within the game itself since it's so large. In this video, you'll be able to hear the layers soloed as well as the full mix.
Awesome. So the next thing we want to talk about is mixing. And now obviously mixing is critical to both tell the story and to give it dynamism. You know, that is enough for a whole complete talk. So we're just going to keep focusing on ambience and how we used mixing within ambience to really help tell the story. So this right here is our bus structure for just some of our ambience. And so just to keep it simple, we're actually just going to drill down and only talk about this section right here. So we're just going to talk about birds for a minute, right? And, you know, this isn't revolutionary or anything, but by splitting up our birds into these different species, we're really able to control what the player is going to be feeling at any time. So if something is really ominous, we might be making sure that the crows are louder or all other birds are silent. You know, something that we do a lot of, and here comes a good spoiler alert to talk more about songbirds, is let's look at the mission A Reckoning in Blood, which is where Taka dies. If you didn't know that, sorry, Taka dies. So now we do this stuff everywhere. Turning stuff up and down. In duels, there's no songbirds because songbirds are pretty and they really help kind of reinforce the natural world, but they can also be really distracting if the player is in a really tense moment or a really somber moment. And so in the example of Taka dying, we're actually turning down the songbirds in a whole bunch of different, essentially, checkpoints within our missions. And so that means as soon as you're bound up, and when the Khan is talking to you, when Taka gets killed, when you break yourself free, and then when you kill all the Ronin in revenge, we're not playing any songbirds because it would just be super distracting to the player and the story if suddenly you heard this beautiful tweet while Jin is going through this really heavy moment of losing such a close friend. Another example that we use kind of this ambient mixing for is for character building and for setting scenes. So I'll show another video, and before the siege of Yarikawa, there's this really great moment between Jin and Yuna, and it starts really light. They're just drinking and having a good time, joking and stuff. And then it's this moment for Yuna's character to really come through, and we really kind of get to hear a bit of really how she ended up as she is. And so what we do there is everything is just playing normally. And then as she kind of starts to go into this somber, serious monologue, we slowly turn down all of the ambience over several seconds, and then we bring the music up. And then she tells her story, and as she finishes, then we kind of reset everything and bring the ambience back up. So let's just take a listen to how this, subtle mix can really make a difference in this character development.
Kenji spent the rest of the day wearing one sandal.
This is terrible.
My mother loved it. Used to drink it like water. She gets so mad when she ran out. Yelled at us. Where's my tea?
Sounds like a demanding woman.
She broke Taka's arm when he was 6. I took him away. Ran as far from her as we could get. We heard they found her a month later. Face down in the street.
You were brave to protect your brother. Sometimes our only choice is to walk away from everything we know.
Okay, and let's just take a look at what that looked like on our side. So this top portion here is actually what our animation events look like. And so you can see at the bottom there, we're pushing or kind of adding a sound state in the middle called Yarikawa Scar's Yuna Sad Moment. And so there's already a polycut Scar's sound state that is active. And then in the middle of this cutscene, we're pushing a new sound state on top of that. And then we're popping or removing that new sound state towards the end. So kind of where you saw those notes about, hey, the ambience goes down, the ambience comes back up. And then you can see at the bottom part where we're actually kind of adjusting the transition times between those states to really give us that nice in and out, kind of really smooth transition in and out. And then on the mixing side, this is what's going on there. So we're basically taking, these are our two main environment buses, and you can see that polycut Yarikawa Scar's Yuna Sad Moment state there, and we're turning all of our environment way down. And that just does a really great job of really helping to focus everything on the story being told there of Yuna's struggle. And with that, I'm going to push it over to Andrew to talk about music.
Cool. Thanks, Brad. As Brad said earlier, the game Ghost of Tsushima is a really big game to play. There's a plethora of content at your fingertips. We've got 15 to 20 hours of main story missions, Silver Path side content, a bunch of systemic encounters to get into. And while this is cool from a player experience side, on the music side of things, it presents sort of a problem because there's way too much content there for us to go in and hand score all of it as much as we'd like to. So we need to, using Wwise and help from the programming team at Suckerpunch, put together a system that can help us out and cover a lot of those moments that we can't go in and hand score ourselves. And for Ghost of Tsushima, we put a system together that we like to call the music encounter system. It's on by default. We can override it when necessary, and it's responsible for dynamically scoring all sorts of different situations that you can get into as Jin Sakai, whether that's exploring the island, getting into a scuffle with a couple of Mongols in a field, or infiltrating a large war camp. It handles all those situations. So I want to start by just showing you a broad overview of the system itself. It contains 5 states that are listed here, Explore being the lowest intensity, Combat being the highest intensity. And I'm only going to focus today on Explore and Combat. I'll go over briefly the other 3, but let's start with Explore here. So Explore is the default state for the system. It's what's playing anytime you're not in a story mission or in a combat scenario of some kind. And along with the sound design and ambience that Michelle and Brad and the rest of the Suckerpunch sound team have put into the island, it's what helps breathe life into the island of Tsushima and help underscore Jin's story along the way. Now, a lot of the content that you hear in the Explore playlist, though not all of it, but a lot of it is derived from what we call the Tsushima Suite. And this was written by our composer, Shigeru Umebayashi. And the kind of interesting thing about this suite is we wrote it before we had many really solid story or mission moments to pull inspiration from. But we needed content for the game. So we decided, we got together with Brad and creative directors, Jason Connell and Nate Fox, to come up with a few key terms with some supporting statements and artwork that we could give to Ume to write this suite. And we felt like these terms would give us the sonic palette that we needed or that we could use to score the game of Ghost of Tsushima. So these are the 5 terms we came up with. I'll just walk you through them here. So Serenity and Sanctuary, we figured would be great for just exploring the island quietly, or maybe exploring a temple in the forest, something like this. Exile was written almost exclusively with the 3rd act of the game in mind, where Jin is exiled to the snowy northern part of the island. Occupation was written with anything involving Mongols in mind, so lots of darker tones and warlike tones here. And we knew that there would be some paranormal and even scary moments in the game, so we decided to put haunting in the list as well to give us that sort of sound. So this ended up being really fruitful for us on this game. Like I said, it was about 45 minutes of source material. But we can't use that material as is. We need to break it down into smaller bits and pieces that we can use in our system. And on the music team, those small bits that we use in the Explore playlist are what we call moods. So moods are short pieces of music. They usually have a long gradual intro and a long tail. They don't really draw too much attention to themselves, but they should help give like a vibe or a tone or a feeling to what the player is going through at any given point in time. And so using various in-game parameters, we can subtly change the background music that's playing. So on Ghost of Tsushima, we set up about 20 different playlists in Wwise. And using these in-game parameters like time of day, island locations, and most importantly, some story-based state changes, we can custom tailor what's playing at that point. So, for instance, moods that play at night might have a darker tone than moods that play during the day. Once you're in that 3rd act, we moved to a playlist of moods that is drawn almost exclusively from that exile portion of the Tsushima suite that I mentioned earlier. And then after you kill the Khan, spoiler, we move to a playlist that is a little more hopeful and uses some more of Jin's big character themes that we were reserving for more of the story mission and cinematic moments up to that point. So it's a really powerful system that I think helps subtly underscore Jin's progression through the story and hopefully change what the player might be feeling at any given point. And so without further ado, let's move on to a video that we put together that shows a few of these playlists in action. So some cool stuff there. I think it worked really well for the open world portion of the game. So here's our overview of the system again. I just want to briefly touch on the 3 states in the middle before diving further into combat. So approach, we didn't do too much with approach. It's actually more of a buffer zone between being in the open world and encountering Mongols. We make sure that nothing new starts once we're kind of near a Mongol encounter. Once you get within a certain distance of Mongols, we'll kick into infiltrate. And this is some low intensity tension type music for, being close to danger. You're about to get into an encounter with some Mongols. If a Mongol thinks he knows where Jin might be, like he finds a body or maybe he hears something in the distance, that AI state will change us into alarmed, which will just up the tension a little bit from infiltrate. And then once Mongols become fully aware of Jin, we move on to combat. And so combat, I want to dive a little further into. There's a couple of aspects of our combat system that I thought were pretty interesting for Ghost of Tsushima. So the first is we knew right off the bat that we wanted two different intensities, at least two different intensities of combat. Being the large open world game that it is, we knew that there would be some encounters that'd be smaller, like with a couple Mongols on the road, or larger encounters like infiltrating war camps. And we didn't want to have necessarily the same intensity of combat music cover both of those situations. So we knew we wanted those two intensity levels. But there was also a problem in big open world player level progression type games that we've noticed in the past few years on the PlayStation Music team that we've wanted to address but didn't really get a chance to until Ghost of Tsushima. And that problem centers around the fact that the player has free agency in these big worlds. Aside from the story missions that they have to do in order, all the other content in the world, they can address however they want to. You can clear out each area of the map one area at a time as you go. You could engage with one open world Mongol encampment early in the game, get sucked into the story missions for the next 10 hours, and then decide that, you want to go back to the first part in Izuhara and clear out that open world combat that you left behind. The problem there is now you've played for 10 hours, you're getting all the stances, you've got all these different outfits and equipment. Jin is just a more badass samurai at this point. He's becoming the ghost. And you've been fighting more difficult enemies as you go. Now when you come back to the first area, you're going to be encountering those Tribe 1 Mongols that aren't quite as difficult. The encounters aren't going to feel as difficult, they're not going to last as long, and we didn't want to have the same intensity of combat music play in those encounters that might not feel as difficult. So how do we determine how difficult an encounter might feel? Well, we came up with an equation that we could put together. So that equation, if we could bring it on screen, there it is. We start with looking at all the enemies involved in the encounter that you're currently in. Those enemies each have a different intensity value assigned to them. We add those values together, and we divide by a number called the hero factor. Now, this is based on Jin's level at that point in the game. We couldn't use his level verbatim because the math just didn't work out well, so we had to translate that hero level into another number called the hero factor. So that division gives us the encounter difficulty, or the rough difficulty for any encounter that Jin's in. And then we can compare that against some combat thresholds to determine, okay, is this a hard encounter? Is this an easy encounter? Or is this so easy that we don't even need to trigger combat music? So let's run through a little example here. So on screen, you'll see this is a list of the various types of enemies you can encounter in the game and the intensity values that we ended up assigning to them. Let's think up an example here. So let's say you engage with 2 Tribe 1 melees and 2 Tribe 1 ranged Mongols. So Tribe 1 melee Mongols are 12, Tribe 1 ranged Mongols are worth 8. So 12 plus 12 plus 8 equals 40. So that's our enemy value for the encounter. And now let's imagine that you're encountering these Mongols early in the game. You are hero level 0, which comes out to a hero factor in our equation of 1. So enemy value of 40, hero factor of 1, do the math there, and we get an encounter difficulty of 40. But what does this mean? That number alone, we can't really tell much just by that number. We have to compare it to our thresholds. So you can see here we had an easy threshold and a hard threshold. Anything above a 10 and up to a 29, we would consider an easy encounter, and you would get easy combat music for that. Anything above 30, and you would get hard music. We would consider that a hard encounter. So in this example, we've got an encounter difficulty of 40, so we would consider that a hard encounter. You're just starting the game, so any group of enemies you're coming along to is probably going to feel a little more difficult. But what about a player who's been playing for a while? Say they're a level 10 hero at this point. Well, that translates to a hero factor of 2. So that changes our math. Now we're taking that enemy value of 40 and dividing it by 2. Now we're getting encounter difficulty of 20. So let's compare that to our thresholds. And now you'll see that we're not making it over that hard threshold anymore, but we are over the easy threshold. So now that player who's gone and played 10 or 12 hours of story missions and comes back to this encounter, that encounter is not going to feel as difficult for them. And the math is going to work out in our equation to where they're going to get easy combat music. So I want to show you a spreadsheet that we put together that helped us kind of figure out what all of these values should be. On the left here, you'll see the various parts of the equation that go into our equation, so the enemy values and the hero levels and things like that. And I want to highlight this first example encounter here. We were able to plug in the enemy types and see how that would change the split between easy and hard combat. And this first one highlighted here is the example that I just ran you through earlier. So you can see level 0 hero would get 40 and would equal hard combat. You can see that in the red highlighted text. Somebody who is hero level 10, that math would come out to 20, so they'd get easy combat. You can see that in the yellow highlighted text and see the split there between where hard and easy combat would occur. So if we can go over to the right side of this spreadsheet, we can look at how that split would work out for a level 5 war camp. Now, this is arguably one of the more difficult encounters you can get into in the game. So this is going to be harder for more players. So you can see here, pretty much all hero levels end up getting hard combat in this case. Only the 2 highest levels, levels 9 and 10, would get easy in this encounter. So it was just an easy way for us to kind of visualize, okay, with this math, with these values, here's how that split between easy and hard is going to work, and we could adjust things so we can really get that extra level of dynamic to our combat music system and not just play the same combat music for every encounter. And one other thing I wanted to point out is that this isn't just a static decision made at the beginning of the encounter. As you kill Mongols in whatever scenario you're in, that math of that equation is changing. So you might start in hard combat, but as you take people out, you'll get down into easy combat eventually. So I think that's enough of my yapping and numbers and spreadsheets. Let's take a look at a video here of our system in action. And this is actually the whole music encounter system. So it'll start with Jin approaching a war camp. As he gets closer, it'll trigger infiltrate. He shoots some arrows. Mongols become aware. We go into alarmed. It's annotated, so you can follow along with what happens from then on. So check it out. So that's our music encounter system in action. Pretty cool stuff. I think it worked out really well for the game. I wanted to dive into one particular mission that I thought was pretty interesting, musically speaking, and that's the Ghost of Yarikawa. So this is like an example of the Tsushima suite in action. This mission was scored exclusively with the Occupation suite from the Tsushima suite. In this mission, the stronghold of Yarikawa is under siege, and Jin is inside with his friends and allies trying to fight off the Mongols who invade. This was scored like one continuous piece of music from beginning to end, and being able to use the Occupation suite was really helpful and really effective to that end. I have a little video that I want to show you that just shows a couple of parts of the mission. The first part is earlier in the mission. The Mongols have just swarmed Yarikawa at this point. Jin is sneaking through. We're using a much darker portion of the Occupation suite here. And interesting enough, we're using a very stripped down version of our music encounter system. We're only using sneak and combat in this case, but using that darker section of Occupation really helps kind of fit the more foreboding feel of that part of the mission. And the second part of the video This is right after you've killed the general, the boss fight at the end. You'll notice it has a much more triumphant feel, and it just really fits the vibe of the end of the mission really well. And it just shows like the breadth of content that we were able to pull out of some of these suites. So let's go ahead and take a look at this video.
I have to break through the Mongol line. Destroy those siege weapons.
Hunt every Mongol to the last man! Spare no one! Keep after them! No mercy! Cut them down! Take their heads! Everyone to the gate! Push through! All the goals! Stop those! Push them back! Run, cowards!
Awesome.
All right. With that, I'll hand it back over to Brad.
Thanks, Andrew. The thing that I love about that video is that first part of the siege where you're sneaking around. I've played that 50 or 60 times probably, and I never had played it that way. And so my musical experience was always totally different because I always was just getting the infiltrate and the tension rather than the combat so early. But let's move on, and we actually want to deconstruct a few more key moments from the game and talk about the ways that sound helps tell that story. So the first one that we want to look at is essentially what is the intro to combat in the game, which is the very beginning of the Mongol invasion. And so at the beginning of this mission, what you see is you have this really big, epic cutscene with, all of these samurai, and it's just big pomp and circumstance, and the music and everything just crescendos. It's just the super big moment, and then the music swells, and then we go into what seems like the battle, and so we charge down the hill, and it's just war. There's just we drop out the music, and it's just sound effects only because it's such this big, intense, really sound design heavy moment. Now, the first real battle that you fight is at the very end of this mission, where you and your uncle and the samurai who are left are fighting just waves of Mongols. And so what we do here, as basically the samurai get decimated and all that's left at the end is you and your uncle, we kind of do the inverse of what we do at the beginning, where we just start to kind of drop out the sound effects and let the music kind of really lead. And we also really wanted to make things feel desperate for the player. So what we do is, as we're dropping out the sound effects, we actually send the VO and the impacts through some aux buses with a whole bunch of effects. So we're filtering it, and we're just making things feel really swimmy. And so it really feels desperate, and it feels like, you're kind of in this altered state as you're realizing, oh my gosh, we're the last two left. And as you finally kill the last Mongols, all that's left is Jin and his uncle. And that's really what he says as the sound comes back in is, oh, we're all that's left. And so we kind of bring the sound back in just a little bit more subdued as you kind of go on to try to kill the Khan. So let's take a look at that now.
More Mongol dogs! Cut them down! Mongol
We're all that's left.
There is only one path for us. Find the Mongol leader and end him here.
I'll fight beside you to the end.
I know.
And I'm sure, as you can imagine, when we had that originally with the full soundtrack, it was just a much different experience for the player. And so as soon as we started making those mixed choices and using those effects, we really created this really kind of disconcerting, disorienting, desperate feel to that part of the mission. Next, I want to pass it back over to Andrew to talk about our next one.
Yeah, so another kind of key moment early in the game is the release to the open world. So up to this point, you've been in the prologue. You haven't been able to really go and explore the island of Tsushima. And this is the point where you're released into the island itself. And it's a really big and powerful moment that I think sound and music kind of came together to really help sell. So this was born out of something that we did for the E3 2018 presentation, which I believe was the first time we ever showed gameplay. But if you remember in that presentation, Jin gets to the top of a ridge. He gets on his horse and rides his horse down this hill in this dramatic sunlight with pompous grass everywhere, and the music swells up to underscore everything. Some deer run by. It was a really powerful moment that I think we were all really happy with. And that idea sort of stuck around and was repurposed for this release to the open world moment. On the music side, we spent lots of time iterating, trying to get the timing of the music just right to hit that moment that you hit the pampas grass and underscore the title of the game. On the sound side, once that camera pulls back, the sound of the horse is boosted to give it some presence, and the birds as well are turned up to really let the player know that, you know, this world is alive that they're about to be released into. And with all my talk earlier of all these interactive music systems, this is actually a really cool non-interactive moment that, you know, I feel like is just as important and sometimes even more powerful than some of the interactive systems that we put together. So let's check out the video. So we'll hand it off to Michelle to talk about another awesome Sonic moment.
Thanks, Andrew. So, big spoiler. Jin's horse is constant throughout his journey as a samurai to the ghosts. In this scene, we used music, sound, and silence to push the emotional impact of Jin's loss. Spoiler: the horse dies. We have a full mix as Jin escapes his uncle's rejection and punishment of his choices to abandon the way of the samurai. The full weakens as we see the horse, gravely injured, rushing Jin away from harm. The sound effects of the horse become the main focus. Gradually, they decrease, mirroring the horse's decline, and ultimately, the horse sounds end in a soft collapse. Tsushima's powerful and haunting vocals really set the emotional tone throughout the scene. When we implemented the vocal track into the movie, it was like a gut punch. It really amped up the emotion so much, and this led to the choices that we made in the mix and the sound design. We really wanted to let the vocals push us through this sorrowful moment as the horse dies before we took the player back today with a final spoken haiku. So check out the video.
Anyone seen him? May have run north. You two, on your horse. The rest of you, man the gate. There he is, on the horse. Stop him! Get him forward!
Forgive me. We have to reach Ken. Yuna's waiting for us. I'm sorry I couldn't.
All right, so that's what we got. Thank you all for listening and watching, and if we have any questions, we'll happily take them.
What kind of mood are you leaving us with that video? Wow, on the chat on the side, like we were saying, like we have chills and all. Whoa. My God, fantastic presentation. Thank you, so well prepared. Like, and we don't have that many questions from the chat, and we were just exchanging about that. Is there something wrong about the chat? And I think no. I think it was so clear, so well presented, so well structured. Yeah, there's that's exactly what Tiffany wrote, and she said, "I'm blown away," and so on. So you're Major League Pros. That's good. We do have some questions. Thanks a lot. And one comment, like the first cinematic you played, Brad, as well, with the ambience fading out slowly as the narrative and the music was fading in. I was all emotional, and I was like, "Oh my God, I'm, whoo, I'm feeling something there." So I'm just an hour 30, maybe 2 hours down that game. So, and I'm okay with the spoilers and all that. I'm just want to play it more now. So great. That was really great. So I've got like 4 or 5 questions for you. So let's start with this one. It was at the very beginning of your presentation, and just a technical question. So what were your voice counts for ambiances? So how many voices? It seems to be a lot, but
Yes, yeah. So the wind rig that I showed, there was 5 layers just in the wind rig, and there were 4 of those, and there was a lot of blend containers. So that wind rig could actually be using up to 40 voices,
wow.
which is a lot for one system, because that's not thinking about the rain or the combat or the Foley or anything else. So, but because wind was such a critical part of the game, about the mood,
Yeah.
about the setting, we chose to kind of go bigger there. We did a lot of optimization as well. Initially we had most of those blend containers were 3 levels. We had like low wind, medium wind, and high wind. And we use wind a lot in the game, so we were finding that the RTPCs were kind of more in just the mid to high range. So we removed and saved some voices that way by just getting rid of things that we weren't using. And also, things like the rain dripping and the dual wind and the interior winds, those were only happening very, very occasionally. So, our voice limit in total, I think we were capping ourselves at about 90 voices. And so, yeah, it was just a lot of instance limiting and prioritization to make sure that the things that needed to be heard were always audible.
Yeah. And that was a voice count for the PS4, I guess. So there was another question about is there plans out there to port it or adapt it to PS5? And if so, how would you leverage the new hardware? And you might not be able to say anything about it, but it was one of the questions we had. So, okay.
The game is playable on the PlayStation 5. As to if we have additional plans, I couldn't comment on that.
That's fine. That's fine. So a question about mixing decisions, and the question was, were those decisions made on the fly, or were they planned in a big picture decision beforehand, or a mix of both? And by extension, who is involved in that process?
It's definitely a mix of both, and probably more so things that are kind of figured out afterwards. Like an example was the invasion battle. It was a full mix for most of production, and Nate Fox came to me one day, one of our creative directors, and we were just talking about that scene, and then we just started playing around. Like, what happens if we just take the sound out completely? Take all the sound design out and just let the music drive it. And it was like, oh yeah, that feels a lot more desperate. And then from there, it was like, yeah, it still feels too jarring. And I felt that we could do more if we did kind of more of a interactive mix, if you will, where we're slowly pulling things out and then rerouting stuff through some aux buses. So there's definitely a lot of back and forth and kind of figuring out things as we go. Andrew, I don't know if you have any other kind of comments from things that we've done on the music side where mixes have changed over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we go and we drop things in, we're trying to put those levels at places that sit well, but Once you get to the actual mix of the game, at the end, usually we're all sitting in a room together. Although this year we weren't, for obvious reasons. But you sit and play the game and make notes and share those notes and leave yourself open to making changes. I think that's always the best way forward.
Great. So I think mentioning that there were not so many questions, they start coming in. So good thing. I think we're just awaking from the magic that happened during that last hour. Great. So maybe one last question on the wind before jumping on other topics where we were wondering if is it 4 emitters located around the listener, or is it really attached to objects in the environment?
Yeah, so it is 4 game objects that are basically locked to the listener orientation in the 4 cardinal directions. So as you turn, they're locked to the listener. So they are kind of stationary but move with the listener. They're not actually moving as you rotate the camera around. And each one is an individual game object. So that way we're able to pick up kind of the location and parameters of where each of the emitters are, so that if you're on the boundary of, say, a bamboo forest over here and some grassland over here, you're going to hear both of them out of each respective speaker.
Great. Question about Foley. Any information about the character's Foley sound implementation? Is it purely based on animation, or did you use any procedural generative techniques?
We did do a little bit of both. I'll let Michelle talk about that, since she did a whole lot of Foley and animation work.
Great Foley recordings, by the way. The sound was just pristine, just great.
Thank you.
So for each character is kind of broken down into sort of a modular system where each type of movement has an associated sound to that. And so as we go through the animation, we're basically tagging where we want sound events to fire off for each of those pieces of modular sound effects for the Foley. So as a character is lifting an arm, we may have an arm lift that associates with that particular movement. And so we kind of just break it down. It makes it really easy as you're going through to quickly implement all the sound events for each of the movements throughout an animation piece. The sound events obviously have a bunch of variations to them. So an arm lift may have 3 or 5 different sounds for that arm lift. And this, makes the animation sound, different. So it creates less ear fatigue as the animation may loop, play in multiple locations.
Great.
And then, actually, why don't you talk about the footlock real quick, because that was probably the biggest procedural thing where we didn't have to tag footsteps or walking.
Yeah, so definitely a lifesaver, because if you've ever put footsteps in, man, it can be really troublesome trying to shift around where the foot falls onto the surface and everything. So basically, our animators, as they're going through, they would go ahead and keyframe where the foot locking is for each of the footsteps. And we basically piggybacked off that with our visual effects designers to attach the sound effect for the footfalls. It gets even more complicated because it's not just a matter of, every time my foot comes down on a footstep, but we also added an additional layer of movement for Foley on top of that. So we had to basically get the timing down correctly, but it would basically go footstep and then the sound of walking movement. And that meant I didn't have to place all of those things each of the animations. And so I could focus on just highlighting key moments in that animation instead of having to worry about all the footsteps and everything like that. Layer to that is that we add depth to not just footstep sounds, but like basically there's involved. So a light footstep and a medium footstep and a heavy footstep, and those are based on whether or not we're walking or we're running, or if you're sneaking around, we might have even a softer footstep for that. And so then we could basically say, okay, this animation, we're just walking, so we just regular normal walking footstep. But if the animation's running, we can then say, nah, he's running, we want to play a heavier sounding footstep.
Great. Were you factoring in like velocity as well, and mass and other properties like that as well?
Brad might want to
Velocity,
talk
yes.
about that.
Yeah, we were doing velocity, not mass, but we were doing speed, and then we also, kind of like Michelle said, like for handling sneaking and stuff like that, we actually did mix states to kind of make Foley and footsteps a little bit softer when you were sneaking versus just walking and that kind of stuff.
Great, great. Here's a question on music and actually the process of recording the music and integration. So the question goes like this. Did you have any specific request to the composer to get the individual pieces you wanted to reorchestrate? And how much did the music end up changing for when you initially, from when initially delivered? So.
Yeah, so it was actually quite a long process to get to what we ended up with in Ghost of Tsushima. There was a lot of, kind of figuring out this line between really traditional Japanese sounds and Hollywood score. And, we were working with Shigeru Umebayashi, he's got a big background in Hollywood film, but not too much knowledge about video games. So we ended up bringing in a couple of orchestrators to work with him and help fine-tune his cues in a way that we could really use them for our systems and for that Tsushima suite. So, I think where we started and where we ended up being very different. But I think the results, speak for themselves, and we really got to a good place sonically.
So how long did the music creation process lasted? Was it like a 2, 3, 4 years mandate, or was it executed more near the end of the game?
I think we first started talking about the music in 2016, I want to say. It was a while back. It had been a long time. But I don't think we really got either Ume or Alon on the project until maybe 2018 or so. I think there was a lot of discussion in there about just making sure we had the right plan, the right idea, finding the right composer for the project. So this was actually a pretty long process for us. So, but again, I think, the results speak for themselves.
Oh yeah, it sounds fantastic. Here's maybe the last question, and it's about ambient zones. So, is it implemented purely by hand, or did you use some methods to analyze a map and automatically put different type of ambiences per region?
That is enough for an entire separate talk. But I think
Excuse me.
I think the short answer would be that most of our ambience was kind of painted in the world via an expression system, and then we were able to hand paint over that. So everything that I showed as far as forest bamboo, forest conifer, grassland, all of those things were all done procedurally via expressions, and then we could add detail via painting. For the interiors, like all the construction stuff that Michelle showed, she did all of the buildings manually by hand of building the ambient zones. And I don't know if you wanted to comment any more on that.
Yeah, basically the way that the buildings were set up were in this sort of modular system. So even though they may have had like different windows and different roof types and things like that, we were able to kind of basically go through each of the buildings and hand place in the volumes and emitters. And so any number of combinations of those modular pieces of the building would then also propagate what work we did for the volumes and the emitters within that building.
Yeah. How like how large is the island? Like many kilometers by many kilometers, or
Yeah,
yeah?
I think it's 14 square kilometers, somewhere around
Okay.
that.
So
It might actually be
thousands
bigger,
of
but
buildings to cover and
yeah, I
probably.
mean, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, so the way that our art team, they were really smart about it, and it actually was very helpful in how we could have variety, but also have some sort of standardization, is that each of the different zones kind of had their own feel to the buildings. And so Izahara had like a building suite. Uh, the middle one, oh, braining is, I haven't eaten dinner yet.
Toyotama.
Toyotama had her own suite, and then the snowy place up in the north. They had, yeah, Kamiyagata. My blood sugar's low. I'm sorry. Kamiyagata had its own building suite, and so that kind of allowed for you had like 3 or 4 different building styles that came in different configurations, and of course you had different things between Mongol type of buildings and Japanese buildings, and so there was a lot, but because they had the modular system, it made it just super easy that once you got one done, pretty much that model would be complete throughout the rest of the game.
Get it. Great. Well, Brad, Andrew, Michelle, thank you. Thank you so much for participating. Your presentation was just state of the art, perfect, really good. And so we'll just go to our last section. So it's the panel. So Brad, you'll stay with us for the panel. Andrew and Michelle, thanks again.
Thank you.
See you in person maybe in a not too distant future. And
Hopefully.
thank you very much. Yeah,
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks.
You, yeah, thanks everybody.
great. Great.